Have you ever wondered why certain comic artists get so popular? With art, this can get tricky to figure out. Thankfully, this is not the cringe fest known as the modern art scene, so I won't have to measure for some unknown shock factor. And thankfully, it's also not the fine art scene, where speculative markets influence what's perceived as popular. This is good old-fashioned, commercially viable entertainment, where the talented let their own style speak for itself, sell books, and in turn, it signals us to know what is actually high quality. In this video, I'm going to pick out one popular comic artist, break down what makes their style so appealing, also show you my whole process so you can too do some studies with your favorite artists and possibly replicate some of their magic. I just need an incredibly talented, prolific artist to use as an example. Who should I pick? Just in case you were hiding under a rock for decades, Joe Madureira is a legend. He's now a middle-aged guy with a ton of accolades in comics, video games, and art. I just want to give a little background, that way when we see his art later, we have some context. So Joe started drawing young and landed an internship at Marvel in the early 90s, which, because of his style, eventually got him a regular penciling gig on Deadpool. He also worked on X-Men for quite a while, which everybody knows, but Joe breaks away from Marvel and starts creating his own book, Battle Chasers. And all the while, his art is slowly becoming more and more inspired by Japanese anime and manga. And artists being inspired by such things today is like a dime a dozen. But back then, it was enchantingly fresh. He then co-founds a video game company, Visual Games, and starts the acclaimed series Darksiders. Not only known for the fun action gameplay, but the signature Joe Mad style being brought into 3D into these video games. Since then, he's art directed many games and titles, and he's jumped back and forth between comics and print media and video games, and honestly, his style's only gotten more refined as he's aged. Before we get into looking at his art, let me explain the categories in which we'll be viewing his work. So here we go. What makes up someone's art style? Because that's really what we're looking at in these breakdown videos. When I began to organize my thoughts from the many years of studying life and art, I found that this was a lot harder to do. After a while of toiling, I did find 5 large categories that we can apply to his art. And I put them into an acronym that kind of works, it's LIVES, L-I-V-E-S. These break down into line, which is pretty obvious what I'm talking about, the use of line. Interpretation, which encompasses a whole lot, but I will get to that shortly. Value, which speaks to the use of black and white and how to render. And the X factor, which is pretty subjective, and in general, it's kind of difficult to describe in a quick way, so we'll leave that for later as well. And finally, shape, which speaks to the 2D shapes that are applied and created when you make a piece of art. When you start out studying any artist, the question I would ask is, how do they use each one of these categories to their advantage? I like using visuals, so naturally I put these categories into some sort of weird shape where I can start to visualize how each category is a section or a piece of the puzzle, a part of the whole. And also I like Tony Robbins, so he did some shit like this. But anyway, let's break down some of these things into a little more detail. For line, we will look for how the artist uses line weights and how their use of the economy of line is utilized. We'll talk about that later. For interpretation, it starts getting tricky, but the main point here is how an artist interprets reality. This is how they include their gestures and how much they exaggerate or simplify, and how they arrange their shots and use composition, and also how they incorporate storytelling techniques. Let's jump to shapes. I know it's at the end, but for shapes, we're concerned with all the 2D shapes created by the lines on the page. This includes shadows, compositional blocking, as well as the positive negative spaces that are created when you add them. Now, value is pretty straightforward, as we really are talking about how the artist lights their scenes. Do they use solid blacks a lot? Are there a lot of halftones? Do they hatch? Do they cross hatch? Do they use gradients? Do they rely on color? All these choices and the balance between clean rendering, solid blacks, and how they address the gradual transition between light and dark is a huge part of the final look of their style. And finally, there's the artist's X factor. This is what I would call their idiosyncrasies that end up in their work. It's going to vary wildly between artists because it's very subjective, and I think every person viewing someone's X Factor would maybe come up with something different, but I have a good way to think about it, and I'll bring that up later on when we're looking at his work. But in essence, the artist chooses what to include and what to exclude in their work. So the possibilities are endless, and it's not obvious what ends up in someone's art. It's like only in retrospect can you view the art and think, could you make it any other way? You know what I mean? But in reality, yes, the art could have been made in literally an infinite number of ways. Now, all these categories make what I like to call a dynamic contrast. I've talked about them in my previous videos, so watch those, but pretty much it's a way to highlight features in art and also include intervals of strong use of different techniques. So now we know what to look for. So the next step is a simple, careful observation. Find examples of the artist's best work in your opinion, and each piece doesn't need to be a super hit, but they need to have some aspect, one category or two categories, that are being used really well in that piece. For example, you could find some great line work and simplified exaggeration in one piece, and then find a cover, a completely different piece that has a fresh idea for one of the other categories as a framework. Now let's get to observing. But actually, beforehand, be sure to observe the like and subscribe buttons. This channel is a big passion of mine, and if you're enjoying yourself, hit them up to let me know you want more. Okay, I'm bringing up some of Joe's interior pages for Avenging Wolverine. So once you bring up the art for your favorite artist, ask yourself, what do I like about what's being drawn here? This basic question allows you to have a starting place and identify what's in the art. In this first panel, what I notice is the blocking or the spacing of the characters within the frame. But what occurs to me is that I notice now that because the light is coming from somewhat of the top left, it's creating the vertical strips of shadow in the door and in the big section of the characters. Because it deals with shapes, values, and X Factor, you should make little notes with their headings. That's what I do anyway. Value because naturally we're seeing how much he's using solid black, shapes because the specific shapes of the shadows are created, and the X Factor because he's choosing to use these lighting scenarios in the first place, which the lighting is purposely shadowing whole section of the figure for easy reads and dramatic effects. Let's move to the second panel now. This one is focused on the characters, and clearly he's pushing the expression to be detailed and exaggerated a bit. This file's under interpretation because he's interpreted the storytelling and the human facial features to be drawn in such a heightened sense of expression. And finally, on the last panel, I really like how he's using line. First and most notably is the heavy contour on the striking arm of Elektra, I think. So it's much thicker in places than most of the lines on the panel, so our eyes can't help but look there. It's also a nice organic thick to thin feeling that doesn't necessarily reflect the lighting, but it's simply there to help you pop out that bit of action from the panel and help the viewer know what's going on. Now let's talk about the economy of line here. When I talk about economy, it refers to how much line is being used, pretty much how much bang for your buck are you getting. This is an area where Joe excels in to the stratosphere. Notice where he leaves blank areas because the simple amount of detail given is enough to convey the message. There's no need to render every scratch of armor or go all high school on rendering the gun or complicate the silhouettes any more than he already has. Noticing this last fact really marks a milestone in studying Joe's work. Beyond values and shapes, the economy of line is a big standout for what makes his work feel like the perfect amount of detail. Before moving on to another page, let's use another quick example so you really get the idea of what we're going for here when you study your own favorite artist. For example, I notice a lot of strong motion is going on in this one panel without using a lot of speed lines. The curved exaggerating door that's bent there, the character's gesture, and the debris in the air is enough without the speed lines. It's pretty impressive. As you notice something, outline them in shapes. It'll solidify in your mind what is being identified. Next, I see a large shadow shape here that are bolt together. Again, this is bulking of shadow shapes. It's a lot of black work here. Parts of the wall behind the door are created like these big, large shapes that clearly show the doors popping in front of the wall. And that is because there's intersecting lines. And we really notice it because the darks of the black shadows really stand out. Now, notice that Joe keeps whatever's in the back room behind the door is pitch black. If he tried to show more detail back there, which many more amateur artists would, it would make me pull away from the story point. And lastly, I noticed that he's blocking out parts of the character attire even though it doesn't necessarily follow the lighting. Like he's bulking this shadow on this one part of the body where it doesn't really need to be total black, but he's doing it for clarity. So one of the biggest things I noticed about Joe's work is his chunkiness of his style. This is something I've been saying for years. I don't know if anyone else describes his work as chunky, but it's the best word I can come up with for some reason. This is one aspect of his art that really remains iconic to this day. It's the choice to make objects in a scene somewhat cartoonish or simplified for clarity in exchange for a little bit of detail, we'll say. For example, this large vault door, has many components that look really technical, but he chooses to keep that detail and reduce it maybe by 60% of what's kind of really there in a reference photo. Okay, let's look at one more page. Panel 1 here has an immediate shapes annotation. The figures are creating a great positive versus negative shape dynamic. Notice how each figure's body language is distilled into a clear and unique shape. Not only that, but bulking the shadows here are creating a feeling where it's describing the character. He has a scared man that's almost all the way in shadow, and which maybe has him fitting the mood. And many of the other shadows on this hooded figure are sharp and showing that he's dangerous. It's very cool. In the next panel, we'll see how Joe addresses value. We've already seen how he bulks shadows together to help our eye have a more pleasant traveling experience across the page. Moving on, let's take a look at rendering. Here we get a good snapshot of how Joe renders. And ideally, he uses hatching. That's one unidirectional hatching, not cross hatching. One directional hatching either goes from a gradation perspective or does a flick of hatching toward the light. We've talked about this in other videos. Sticking with the same panel, let's talk more about this X factor thing. We want to expand our minds a little bit to find not just what he decided to include and draw, but what he's purposely not drawn here for better visual experiences. The examples are deciding to entirely shade the back arm on this creepy dude, then cropping out the face at the top to only show the mouth, and also keeping this creepy facial detail to a minimum, pretty much using the economy of line. Now let's look at what's cool here, because that's kind of another effect of the X Factor. We're looking at what really is appealing about his work. And I think these round black eyes of the girl and this really dark contrasting head shape that is also round on this girl is super appealing. It's the immediate eyeball snatcher for the page. That could easily have been overdrawn or easily distract from other elements, but he got the perfect amount of facial detail on this creepy dude versus all the detail on the girl's face and just made it very simple and effective. Now, if you haven't watched the first breakdown videos that I've already put out, first of all, watch those for sure. This next step of visually showing my findings is where those videos start off. So everything I've done previously, this is the extra treat that I wanted to give you guys from all the comments that I've gotten on those videos. So my intention here is to isolate each of my findings from our observation stage. Let's start with line because it's the beginning of the acronym. I want to give an example of how much line weight is applied to much of Joe Mad's contours. So I just place a few shapes and connect them with simple junctions. The economy is a tough one to demonstrate. One, because I'm not as skilled as Joe Mad, but also because a subject really needs to be a concrete one so you can really tell what's the difference between something more realistic or something more detailed and something that's more effective and simple. In future, I will be kind of brainstorming a better way for this representation. Let's move on to interpretation. It's another tricky example to distill, but for this category, we want to show the gestural, energetic, exaggerated nature of Joe's work. I wanted to use non-objects, like abstract ones, to show this. That way we can just focus on the flow of the shapes here. The point of this next little doodle I do is to demonstrate Joe's methods for value. That'll include the hard set of cast shadows, a single directional hatching, and making use of those shapes that all pop away from the detail. I think this also does a somewhat better job of showing the economy of line than even the line section does, but I digress. I make sure to include a small section to show the hatching going in both directions, and I was very careful as to how much the shadows took up of the whole piece. This is very deliberate. See how I charted at the bottom here? It's something like 60 to 40% split. He uses a lot of solid black shadows in his work. For X Factor, much of the point of this category is, like I said, the content itself. It's what he chooses to show, what he chooses not to show, and what to exclude. So I'll do my best to keep this abstract and try to keep just everything as contrasting as possible. This dynamic contrast that he gets with his X Factor is coming from many things that is hard to distill in this little tiny example, but we'll do it more and talk about it more in concept. And last is shape, which I think is the best and biggest category for Joe. Joe's choices in shape tend to be great. Joe's used much of the Art Adams inspiration in his work, especially in his early career, but as the years have gone on, he's adopted what I call the chunky volumes that I've talked about. He's got this chunky mix of careful things going on. The economy of line, the simplified but three-dimensional set of forms that are coming together, and a great use of silhouetting, which also deals with the positive-negative space in composition. These combine to make an unmistakable shape that most comic readers can spot a mile away. I noticed in my first video that many of you really guessed Joe Mad above all others, and that's because his shape language is off the charts. Notice how I've also added a mystical swirl here that appears in much of his work. It's another thing that anybody reading comics will know that's Joe Mad stuff. And also, this one shape is kind of like an analogy for perfectly describing Joe Mad's approach to art. This swirl that he draws in a ton of his art is eye-catching, symbolic, it's technically really well drawn, but it's also dynamic. It moves around, feels really nice, and has motion to it. All the words that I just used, I think, perfectly describe Joe's work. And I do a bit of a breakdown here to lay out how I think Joe wants to combine realistic features of objects and skew them in a way where it feels fantastical, but also three-dimensional, that chunky feeling. And last, I did this little doodle to show how Joe kind of does quick silhouettes of shapes to really emphasize certain things within a composition and use that positive negative space. So just to clean it up and as always have fun, I kind of mimic his signature as I do with most artists. I want to try to draw his signature for some reason. As promised, let's try and replicate some of the magic that Joe has in his work. So let's discuss the 3 big lessons I took away from studying Joe Mad's work as I draw. And also, what I'm doing here, where I'm taking simple shapes and maybe something more complex at the end to try to replicate, is exactly what you want. You want something where you can experiment. You don't want to do this on a final piece or anything. You want to do a lot of these little tiny experiments and see what's really working. Okay, so my hot take number 1 is Joe Mad chooses wisely.
You have chosen wisely.
I think much of what makes Joe Mad's style work is because he chooses the material being drawn and how to stage that material in the best way possible. At the end of the day, Joe chooses the most cool situations to draw outside of all the technical prowess and execution. And that's why his work's so good. For example, you want to choose a lighting scenario that works best for your dynamic contrast. In Joe's case, he's shading and rendering is pretty simple, but if you focus on the lighting, you can notice that he places lights in a scene where the shadows casted afterward will specifically describe the story in a way he wants. The mood and all the forms will be described clearly and in the way that he wants you to feel. Joe Mad makes it easy to read. And I'm not just meaning easy to read the book, like the storytelling or the words, because that's almost not in his world. His use of exaggeration and simplification, and also economy of line, is for your clarity. Joe Mad is the king of easy reads. Visually, you cannot help but know what's going on in the scene, because it's so clear. If you want to accentuate a bit of action or a key figure, why not throw a heavier, more dynamic line weight on it? Want a scene that feels a little bit more alive? Add a bit of small debris or little things in the air. Give it a little bit more energy and show it clearly instead of just bombarding everything with speed lines. I don't do that. Along the same thought process, if you create an exaggerated and almost symbolic representation of the objects and people you're actually putting in your work, they become your tools and your work is going to be more engaging and more clear. But, this is a huge but, just be sure to follow the fundamental rules of art. Just like his inspiration, Art Adams, Joe Mad's work stands on its own. As an aside, my channel does have some useful videos on that side of things. The fundamentals, lighting, color, drawing, penciling, it's all there, so check those out. Okay, take 3. Joe Mad uses expression. He's expressive. And no matter if we're talking about composition, or if we're talking about characters, or we're talking about just facial features, he's doing it. No matter what you're drawing, if you want to snag some of that specialness that is within Joe's work, be a little bit more expressive. Don't be so caught up in trying to get it so perfect that you miss the energy and you miss the actual character that you're drawing within your character. Subtlety is useful, but I don't think that is where Joe Mad pulls from. I think where you want to pull from, if you're trying to emulate something from Joe, is you want something that's more engaging and dynamic. And if that means you have to push your characters and compositions to maximize the memorability, do it. So this has been a fun video. I love talking about the breakdown, but this time I actually got to show you guys how I go through it every time I've been making these videos. It's very fun to show the process, and I really wanted you guys to have these same kind of powers of study. Joe is known for being the harbinger of Eastern styles and creating a body of work that is like a smash hit always. It's like always entertaining the world, and no matter if that's in comics or in video games. If you're a fan of Joe's work, let me know what piece that got you into his work. Like, I want to know where you started following his work. For me, it goes way back to X-Men, but let me know where you found it. Was it Darksiders? Was it Battle Chasers? Let me know what has inspired you from his work. And if you don't like Joe's work, let me know why too. That'd be really interesting. I don't know if there's many of you out there, but let me know what you think. So if you like this video, please hit the like. Let me know in the future what you want to see when I do a breakdown video. Let me know which artist you want me to break down. Lastly, guys, follow me on X. And if you guys want a micro art lesson, something you can read in like a minute every week that comes straight to your email, sign up for Good Art Tips that I'm putting out in the link in the description. Click that, sign up. I send one out every Wednesday, and you just have a little happy art tip that kind of gets you inspired every week. I look forward to making more videos for you guys soon. And as always, be good, everybody.